everyone. Welcome to today's event with the title, The Impacts of Economic Sanctions on Food Prices Security, Evidence from Targeted Countries. I am Mahdi Gotsi, and I am an economist from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Today's presenter, or the main speaker, is Silvanus Kouakou Afesorgpour, and he's from the University of Gulf, and we have also a discussant here to discuss Kouakou's paper, and our discussant is Angela Kipti, and she's from French Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment. And this event is part of the seminar series in international economics that is jointly organized by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies in cooperation with Research Center International Economics and the European University Institute. So these seminars in international economics are intended to be a forum for presentations and discussions of research findings of economists in the field of international economics, that we focus usually on international trade, trade policy, foreign direct investment, and international migration. To give you some housekeeping rules, in the new format of the seminars in international economics, we have a presenter and a discussant. Usually we give about 30 minutes for the presentation of the main paper, and then we have a 15 minutes of discussion by the discussant. At the end, we have a Q&A session that will take about 15 to 20 minutes. So you have the opportunity to ask your questions in the chat, and if the question is on a pressing issue, and if it needs some clarification by the speakers, I will check the question, I will ask the question myself. I hope I can interrupt the speakers. Otherwise, we will collect all the questions for the Q&A session at the end, so that everyone could have a chance to unmute or even turn on the camera to ask the question themselves. Then the event is being recorded, so it's an important note to tell you that the event will be recorded, and in the future we will upload the recorded video of this webinar on the YouTube channel of the wiiw, and the slides will also be uploaded on the wiiw website after the event is finished. At the end of the event, you will also receive an email on an online survey that will be sent to you, and we are usually asking for your evaluation as well as your comments that could help us in the future seminars. So in order to introduce the speakers, Kouakou is an associate professor of agri-food trade and policy at the Department of Food, Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Gulf in Canada, and a research associate at the Environment for Development Initiative in Ghana, which is a Swedish research institute. Then we have also Angela, who is working as a researcher at the economics department of the French Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment, INRAE, and she was a former Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Institute for Applied Economics Research at the University of Tübingen. So we have the pleasure to have you here, and we have a very important topic to discuss, which is on the effects of sanctions or economic sanctions on food security, which is a very critical issue for many countries in the least developed countries and developing countries that are affected significantly by economic sanctions that are imposed globally. So Kouakou, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, as well. Angela, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. Kouakou, the floor is yours. You have about 30 minutes.
Good morning from Canada, where I just came about 3 days ago, and thank you for organizing this seminar. My name is Silvanus Kouakou Afesorgpour. As I've been already introduced, I'm an associate professor at the University of Guelph, the Department of Food, Agriculture and Resource Economics. But currently I'm on sabbatical, so I'm a Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute, where I met Fabio. So this was a project that I just started working on recently when I went on sabbatical at EUI in Florence. Yeah. So the title of my paper is The Impacts of Economic Sanctions on Food Prices or Food Security and Evidence from Targeted Countries. This is a joint work with Lucas Konha from Bonn, University of Bonn in Germany, and then Fabio, who is also a professor from EUI and another university in Italy. Yeah. So before I delve into the paper, I would want to say a few things that this is also very preliminary. A lot of the work we started not too long ago, we are trying to even, some of the results that we have found, we are trying to even rationalize, we are trying to find an intuition for some of those results. So your comments are very much welcome. We want to improve the quality of the paper considerably from what it is I'm presenting now. And then I also have to apologize to the discussant because I think maybe there's what I've sent to you and what I present, sometimes you may see a bit of mismatch. I've not been able to react. So what I'm presenting today is just take that one. You can ignore some of the things you see from the paper. Yeah, so it tells you it's a work in progress. Yeah, so thank you very much. First, I'm looking at economic sanctions. And sanctions is basically defined as actions that a sender or a group of senders will take to limit or end economic relations with a target in an effort to persuade that target to change its objectionable policy. So with sanctions, there are two authors. We have the sender, who is the one who imposed the sanctions. And then we also have the target, who is the one who is sanctioned by the sender. We can have a group of senders imposing sanctions on one particular target, and there are different purposes for imposing sanctions. One could be to promote democracy, or it could be maybe to combat terrorism, or maybe nuclear proliferation, or maybe to combat human rights abuses or change in government or anything. So there are different reasons for imposing sanctions. But one thing that I've always said about research on sanctions is that whether sanctions are effective in changing the actions of the target, maybe towards the sender, whether they are effective or not, they have consequences for the people that live in those countries. So I will start with my first slide that talks about my motivation. Okay, so this is just the outline of my presentation today. I'll talk about the motivation, and I'll also talk about the literature review, and then the theoretical perspective, and then I'll talk about data methodology, and then my results. Yeah. So what are the first motivation for working on sanctions? One thing that we can all attest to is that there's an increasing use of sanctions within the foreign policy circle, within the diplomatic circle. So if you turn on your TV or you are listening to the news, you hear a lot about sanctions. That maybe the US is imposing sanctions on Russia, or maybe for invasion of Russia, or different, or maybe it's North Korea or Afghanistan or anything. So we've seen that there's this continuous use of sanctions over time. So sanctions have become a very hot topic. And if you look at the evolution of sanction cases over time, you can see that there's been this exponential increase. You know, between 1990 and 2009, they call this a sanctions decade, where we've seen a lot of sanctions being imposed. But even if you look at it around that time, the average number of sanctions per year was about 250. But now if you compare to between 2010 and 2019, it has almost doubled. So we are seeing that exponential increase in the use of sanctions over time. And, you know, it's not surprising that we are seeing this increasing use of sanctions. One major reason is this, that people say that sanctions are a better alternative to military interventions. you can either intervene, maybe using a military force, or you can impose sanctions. So people think that the one that is of a lesser evil is the sanctions. So because of that, most countries will prefer to use sanctions than maybe be directly involved, militarily involved in another country. And we know with military interventions, there is maybe loss of property, there's also loss of lives and all of that. And we don't see that directly with sanctions. We may see that indirectly with sanctions, because if you sanction a country, and it could also contribute to maybe a human lives lost, or maybe food insecurity, or it can also contribute in different ways. And then the second motivation is a focus on food price, because we are looking at the impact of sanctions on food prices and food security. You know, food prices is a critical food security indicator in most countries. If you look at the different dimensions, they have about 4 main dimensions of food security. One of the critical is access to food. And one thing that is a predicator of access is food prices. So anytime there's an increase in food prices, you see that it has a lot of implication for the poor. And one very important thing is that we know that, especially in developing countries, who are mostly targeted with sanctions, they spend a higher proportion of their income on food. So even if there's a marginal increase in price of food, the implications are substantial for a lot of people in those countries. And we've seen that most sanctioned countries have also experienced a surge in food prices, maybe after the imposition of sanctions. And there are many examples of that. We saw that in Iran, there was almost a 30% increase in consumer prices following sanctions after its nuclear enrichment program. We also saw that inflation increased almost by 15% in Russia after sanctions were imposed for its annexation of Crimea in 2014. And then we also saw that in Venezuela, there was a hyperinflation, like inflation was really high after a long period of sanctions. So all these events just gives a kind of an anecdotal evidence that there is some kind of linkage between economic sanctions and then maybe food prices or food insecurity. And then when we look at also food security is a very pertinent global concern. We saw it in the Millennium Development Goal, which was the target. The first goal was on end hunger and reduce famine. So, and this goal was also reintroduced in the Sustainable Development Goal as well. If the SDG, the second target, also focused on the same thing. And this is not surprising, because over the MDG, we saw that around 2015, we saw there was a long-term decline in the prevalence of undernourishment over time. But in 2015, there was this kind of a potential reversal. So it came onto the radar of a lot of international organizations that we are seeing a kind of a reversal in food security. So we saw that was reintroduced in the SDG as well. In a more recent report, FAO links the surge in food prices as the significant factor contributing to an increase in the number of people lacking access to healthy diet. The number of people lacking access to healthy diet has risen by 112 million to nearly 3.1 billion people in the world. So that tells you that food security is a huge concern across different countries in the world. And you know, incidentally, when you go to let's say the Global Hunger Index, and then you are looking at the countries that are highly food insecure or countries that are suffering from undernourishment, most of these countries, incidentally, are also countries that have been sanctioned. So if you look at Burundi, Eritrea, Yemen, Afghanistan, all of these countries are countries that are also under sanctions. So there can be some kind of a linkage, or there's some kind of an anecdotal evidence that maybe sanction could be contributing to this kind of food insecurity or high food insecurity in some of these countries. If you look at the historical and recent cases about sanctions, you know, sanctions have been targeted on food. People say that they're using food as a weapon of warfare. So you are trying to restrain food to your enemy, because maybe soldiers will have to eat food before they can be able to fight a war. So one way to fight a war is also to what? Maybe impose food sanctions, in terms of maybe you ban export of food to those countries, or you put some kind of prohibitive tariff, or there could be also a kind of an import restriction or anything. So if you look at historically, the US Embargo Act of 1807 restricted trade between the US and the UK. And according to studies that have been done, mostly from the political science, they claim that this embargo contributed to a significant jump in corn prices in the UK. And we also have the 1980 grain embargo that was imposed by US on Russia. There was also this 1994 Glenn Amendment Act that also required US to restrict exports of farm products to countries that had nuclear enrichment programs, such as Pakistan and India. So historically, you can see that there's been a number of cases where food was used as a way, or food sanctions were imposed on countries. And more recently, we've also seen that we've seen sanctions and counter sanctions on agri-food products by the EU and Russia, following Russia's annexation of Crimea. And also more recently, we've seen that the global food inflation, most people are attributing that to maybe the sanctions on Russia, and then the Russia-Ukraine war and all of that. So there's a lot of examples to show that there's a lot of linkage between sanctions and then food prices and food insecurity. You know, when you look at the empirical literature on sanctions, it's mostly dominated with the topic focusing on whether sanctions are effective or not. So they talk about effectiveness of sanctions. Effectiveness of sanctions is basically just looking at whether, when I impose sanctions on you, when a sender imposes sanctions on a target, whether the target has changed its policy, its objectionable policy. So mostly the empirical literature is mostly about effectiveness of sanctions, whether sanctions are effective or not. And the conclusion is that in limited number of cases, sanctions are only effective in limited number of cases, where maybe I'm imposing sanctions because you have invaded this country, and then I impose sanctions, and then you stop the invasion. They say that they are not very successful in changing those objectionable policies. And then in terms of its effect on nutrition and health, there's also a lot of studies that have shown that sanctions have contributed to hunger and famine in Cuba. You know, Cuba has been under sanctions in the 60s for a very long period of time. And then there's also been a fall in nutritional value in Cuba. There has been increase in under 5 mortality and infectious disease in Iraq, and all of that because of long period of sanctions. But that was the previous literature. But now, when you look at current literature, they are talking more about the consequences of sanctions for the target, not just the effectiveness of sanctions. So even though sanctions may not be effective in changing maybe political regimes in the target, in the sanctioned country, it has consequences, unintended consequences for the targets, or mostly for the citizens or the population within the target. So we say that while sanctions are imposed to marginalize the political regime or diminish their support, it also has the tendency to create a vulnerable and food insecure population that becomes more dependent on the political regime. So that's also something that a lot of studies are focusing on. So there are studies that have looked at how sanctions affect economic growth, poverty, and income inequality. I have done a paper in 2016 that looked at the effect of sanctions on income inequality. And I saw that sanctions widen the income inequality gap. So when there's sanctions, you see that the rich people within the sanctioned countries become richer, whilst the poor people become poorer. So at the end, there's this widening of gap between the rich and the poor. There's also been a number of studies that have been done on economic growth, that sanctions reduces growth. It also increases poverty and also widening the poverty gap. And all of these are there. And then there's also studies that have also looked at the impact of sanctions on trade, especially trade between maybe the sender and then the target. And it shows that there's a substantial reduction in trade between the sender and then the target. I also did a study in 2019 that also looked at the effect even on essential products. I was looking at different types of product that are affected when there's sanctions between the sender and then the target. And I could also see that even there is a reduction in food, as well as a reduction in pharmaceutical products between the sender and then the target when there is sanctions between the sender and then the target. And then more recently, there's been a study also that looked at the impact of sanctions on food prices, focusing on particularly on Russia. And they looked at the counter sanctions that were imposed by Russia on the EU. And these were mostly on agricultural products. I think they looked at 48 agricultural products. And they said that because this one, it was Russia banning the import of agricultural products from the EU in retaliation to sanctions that were imposed on Russia. And the study is telling us that, it tells us that because of these counter sanctions by Russia, there has been an increase in food prices. And also that has led to a reduction in what? In welfare, consumer welfare for people of Russia. So in a nutshell, people in Russia are paying some of the price of the sanctions, even compared to maybe the political elites whose actions may be the one leading to the imposition of the sanction. So what is our main objective here? What is our main contribution here? Our objective here is to quantify the impact of sanctions on food prices, and then to also assess its broader implication for food security. Here we use the prevalence of undernourishment. And then how different instruments of sanctions can affect food prices and then food security. And here, when we're talking about different instruments, because I told you that with sanctions, the sender could employ different instruments. Maybe it could be trade ban, export ban, import restrictions, imposition of a prohibitive tariff, or it could be, let's say, a cut of freezing of assets, financial assets, or maybe ban of international remittances or transfer, the ban of SWIFT code and all of that. So there could be different instruments or different tools that could be employed by the sender in imposing sanctions. But we could classify them more broadly into maybe trade sanctions, financial sanctions, and then travel sanctions. Travel sanctions is where maybe impose some kind of travel restrictions on political elites so that you cannot be able to maybe travel from your country to the sender country, the country who is imposing the sanctions. And then the third contribution, we also try to look at whether there's any heterogeneity in terms of the sender, because we are looking at sanctions that were imposed by the US, the EU, the United Nations, and other Western nations, most of them within the OECD countries. Yeah. Okay, then we look at the theoretical argument. You know, there's a theoretical link between sanctions and food insecurity or food security, whatever. One, we can look at it from the political economy angle, where, you know, what happens is this, that the sanctioned country or the targeted country wants to have control over its citizens, because when you impose sanctions, you are trying to trigger a kind of like a revolution within that country. So the political regimes still want to have some kind of control. So one thing they do is to centralize the distribution of food. With that, you can use food as a way to punish public dissent. So people who are not in support of the regime, you could decide not to allocate food to them. So there's some kind of centralization of food. So when I impose sanctions on the country, because the government still wants to have power over its people, they could intentionally undersupply essential goods so that you could use that to punish any public dissent against the government. And there's a very good example in this paper in OISH in 2014. They cite this case in Haiti where the Haitian government destroyed agricultural infrastructure and even prevented agriculture extension officers from offering their services to the Haitian farmers, with the intention of just centralizing the production of food so that they can use that as a way of punishing people that do not support the government. So that is from the political economy angle. And then we can also look at it from the entitlement theory, like, sanctions could undermine production, trade, social transfers, labor, or any of these things could be undermined. And we know that with food security, you need endowment, you need income, you need wealth, you need asset to be able to become food, to be food secure. So, but sanctions could undermine any of these categories of entitlement. So that could have an implication for food security. And then we can also look at it from supply and demand constraints as well. With sanctions, what happens is there is maybe the isolation of the country. The country is isolated from the rest of the world. So agricultural productivity is also likely to decline. One thing is agricultural investment, the risk premium associated with agricultural investment becomes higher. So with that, agricultural investment has to be more profitable for people to even engage in some kind of agricultural investment. So agricultural production could decline because maybe there's also lack of new technology from the sender, because the senders are mostly developed countries, the advanced economies, US, the UK, Canada. Those are the countries that are mostly the senders. And these are countries that do all the agricultural innovation. So the transfer of agricultural technology could be hampered, and that could affect maybe agricultural productivity. There could also be trade restrictions that impose barriers on free trade, which is one of the tools that are used in sanctions. And it could also reduce income generation opportunities for individuals, because the sanctions, employment opportunities are less. So people are not able to work and have enough money so that they can be able to buy food. And then it also undermines social protection program, because the government is affected. Revenue mobilization is affected. So the government does not have a lot of means to be able to support people in terms of maybe social programs, food aid, food banks, and all of that. So there could be food security implications of that. So our main research questions are: do sanctions affect food prices and food insecurity? We use prevalence of undernourishment, POU. And then, do different instruments of sanctions have heterogeneous effect? So I've talked about financial sanctions, trade sanctions, and then travel sanctions. And what is the effect of sanctions imposed by different senders, the US, EU, UN, and then other Western senders? So what data was used? We have data spanning the period 2000 to 2021 for 112 developing countries. And then we also use the economic sanctions a database called the Global Sanctions Database, which is a very new database. There used to be previous databases like the Hofbayer, the threat and imposition of economic sanctions, but this new data set is a bit more comprehensive, and it also has data spanning a longer period of time. So it has about over 1,000 cases of sanctions in that data set. And then we also use the Food Consumer Price Index from the FAO. And this measures price changes between current and reference period of an average basket of goods and services purchased by households. And in this, we deflated the food CPI because it's nominal. So we deflated that by normalizing with the consumer price index. And then we also have the prevalence of undernourishment, which is just, it measures the number of people or the percentage of the population that is undernourished or have insufficient amount of food. And then we also have a huge vector of control variables, economic variables like GDP per capita, trade, exchange rate, population growth. We also have weather and agriculture production variables like agricultural stress index, yield, which measures productivity. And then we also have political variables like physical violence or human rights abuses, conflict, coup d'etat, and all of that. So we have institutional, political, and economic control variables. So this is just a definition of some of the variables in the data set and then some of the summary statistics. So you have the food price index, the prevalence of undernourishment. Sanction here is just an indicator variable whether maybe a target country is under sanction by a particular sender at a particular point in time. And then we have all these control variables: exchange rate, trade openness, population growth, yield, which is a measure of productivity, rural population, and all of that. So this is our basic empirical model that we use to look at the impact of sanctions on two main outcome variables. So our two main variables are food price outcome variables are food price and then prevalence of undernourishment. And then our variable of interest here is the sanctions here, which is measured by the coefficient here, gamma. And then we also have the X here, which measures our control variables. We have our fixed effects, the alpha I. Here is our country. This is our country fixed effect, the target fixed effect. And then we also have the sender who is imposing the sanctions we want to also control. So we have a sender. So we have a J, which is the sender of the sanctions. And then we have the dyadic fixed effect, which is trying to look at maybe relationship between the sender and then the target. But this is for variables that do not change over time. And then we also have time that may also control for global events that are common to all the I's. And then we also have our error term. So this is our empirical model that we estimated. But one thing that we know is that sanctions are not exogenous. Sanctions could be very endogenous. There is a literature, there was a paper by Nguyenkesh and Numera that was published in Journal of Development Economics, and they talked a lot about why sanctions are endogenous. They said that, they argue that sanction could be imposed as a result of the negative environment of the target. And this could be also intertwined with the political and economic conditions in the target. So this is a kind of creating some kind of simultaneity bias. The conditions in the target that is leading to the imposition of sanctions. Let's say maybe there's abuse of human rights or there's conflict. All of that could lead to the imposition of sanctions. But those conditions could also have an effect on political and economic outcomes like food prices or food insecurity. So because of that, there's some kind of simultaneity bias, and that could lead to endogeneity. So they recommended the use of this approach. They call it, it's a matching technique. They call it entropy balancing, which is a way to obtain a synthetic control group that is comparable to the treatment group. So here we have sanctions. So when you have sanctions imposed on you, that is considered as treatment. And if there is no sanctions imposed on you, then we consider that as the control, a kind of a control group. But okay, yeah. So we use this entropy balancing, and the way to estimate that, it's a kind of like just a conditional difference in indifference. We call this is the average treatment on the treated, where we are looking at our outcome variables, Y here, which could be food price or the prevalence of undernourishment, when sanction is imposed on you, which is S equals to 1, condition on the control variables, which we also call pre-treatment characteristics. And then we compare that, so it's just a comparison of mean between when sanctions was imposed and then when there is no sanction imposed on you. And that effect is what we call the average treatment on the treated effect. And before you do the entropy balancing, this gives us most of our predetermined characteristics or our control variables. So before the matching, you see that these are countries under sanctions and then countries under no sanctions. If you look at most of the variables that we look at, they are systematically very different. They are significantly very different between countries that are under sanctions and those that are not under sanctions. This is before, but after the balancing, when you compare those predetermined covariates, you see that they are not statistically very different. So the entropy balancing kind of solved that kind of problem of maybe the negative environment. So now we have a kind of a synthetic control group, which is very similar to the sanction group. So we can be able to estimate, we can do our mean comparison to see the effect of sanctions on the outcome variables we are interested in. So this is just a descriptive analysis where I compare the real food price for countries that are under sanctions, which is the black one, and then those that are under no sanctions. You can see that maybe there are some minor exceptions, but on most cases, food prices, real food prices are higher when countries are under sanction, when sanction is equals to 1, compared to when sanction is equal to 0. So that tells you that, yeah, when there is sanction, food prices are likely higher compared to when there are no sanctions. And then for POU, which is the prevalence of undernourishment, you can see that consistently we see that when countries are under sanctions, the percentage of the population that is undernourished is higher compared to the percentage that is not, compared to the countries that are not under sanctions. And then we look at our first empirical estimation, where we look at here, we did not differentiate between the senders. So we are just looking at what is the effect of sanctions on food prices, on real food prices. And when you do that, you see that consistently, we find that the effect of sanctions on food prices is positive and very significant. You see, we did different models. In our last model, we control for the target fixed effect, we control for the sender fixed effect, we control for the dyadic fixed effect, which is the target and the sender, we control for the year fixed effects, and then we also look at the entropy balancing, which is a way of solving the endogeneity. But in the previous, we just vary some of the fixed effects, and then you can see, but it looks pretty almost very consistent. In terms of the estimation, in terms of the interpretation of the coefficient here, this is because we normalize the food price index with the consumer price index. So if you look at here, you can see that the real food price index is just, it's very small, between like 0.8 and then 1. And so here, if you see an effect of, let's say, 0.14, it tells you that food prices are higher by that point within a sanction year compared to non-sanction year. So food prices are higher by, or you can also convert into percentage and say that food prices are at 1.4% higher during sanction year compared to non-sanction year. And then we look at the different instruments or the different types of sanctions. We look at trade, financial, and travel. And then we also look at the different combinations, because sometimes countries employ the different instruments. They put them, there's a combination. So we look at, okay, when targets are under only trade sanctions, or when they are only under financial sanctions, when they are also under travel sanctions, or when they are under a combination of maybe 2 or 3 of them. And here you can see that when countries are under, when there's a combination of trade, travel, and financial sanctions, the effects are more pronounced in terms of food prices are higher by almost 4.2 percentage higher than when there are no sanctions. And then we also look at the different senders of the sanctions. We look at the EU, US, UN, and other Western senders, the OECD countries. And here, surprisingly, we found that EU, when sanctions that are imposed by the EU, the effects are very significant, but not for the US, and then not for the United Nations, which is a bit it's very counterintuitive for us. We are still trying to rationalize the reason behind that. And then we move to POU. So we just repeated almost the same thing we did for food price. We look at the different types of senders. But here, POU is measured in terms of percentage. So they look at the percentage of the population that is undernourished. So if you want to interpret this result, this should be interpreted in terms of percentage point. So if you look at the column 6, this is telling us that with the imposition of sanctions, prevalence of undernourishment is higher by 2 percentage points during the sanction year compared to non-sanction year. So that will be the interpretation of that. So this is percentage point. So for the food price, it's unitless. We don't have any unit, but this is percentage point. Yep. And then we also look at the different types of sanctions as well. We look at trade, financial, and the results look very similar. We have, the effects are almost similar across the different types of sanctions and all of that. And then we also look at the different senders of sanctions as well. And consistently now we find that the US effect is still not significant, but now we see that UN effects is more pronounced and very significant. And then other Western sanctions senders are also very significant as well. So in conclusion, we said that sanctions result in real-term increase in food prices. And then during sanction period, food prices are higher by 0.1 to 0.14 compared to non-sanction period. And also various types of sanctions exhibit very similar effect on food prices, with a more pronounced impact observed with a combination of trade, travel, and then financial sanctions. And then we also saw that EU and other Western sanctions had influenced the effect of sanctions on food prices compared to US and the UN sanctions. And then when it comes to prevalence of undernourishment, we also found almost something very similar. Sanctions contribute to higher POU. And then the effects are also very similar across different senders and then across also different types of instruments of sanctions. So thank you, and your questions are very much welcome.
Thank you very much, Kwaku, for your excellent presentation. Now let's give the floor to Angela and then provide the floor for discussion afterwards. Angela, the floor is yours.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, please. So thank you for inviting me to comment on this paper. It's a very interesting issue, and I was very pleased to, to accept this invitation. Okay. I'm trying to make it full screen. Can you see my slides?
We see the slides, but it's not on full screen, but I think it's fine.
I can redo the manipulation again. It didn't work.
Yeah. But I think this is okay. We can see, so yeah.
Yeah, we can see.
Just can do it. Okay. So just to briefly summarize the papers, paper analyzes the impact of sanctions on food prices and hunger, or food security, like measured by the prevalence of undernourishment in targeted countries. And well, the main contributions of the paper, first, it provides new knowledge on this issue because the literature relies mostly on case study analysis and some limited evidence on how sanctions impact food inflation. The paper analyzes not only the impact on the price of food, but also on food security, food prices being an essential element of it. And they explored heterogeneous effects across both the type of sanctions and senders. And in the manuscript I received, there was also an attempt trying to explore a number of mechanisms at work. And I would strongly encourage authors to work in this direction in this paper or later on, because I'd very much like to learn more on this issue. So it's mainly an empirical analysis. My figures are slightly different from what was finally presented. So I had information that there were 99 developing targeted countries in the study, and the sanctions imposed by 30 Western economies and some multilateral organizations. And an important part of the analysis, we focus on trying to solve the empirical difficulty you have in analyzing the impact of sanctions, especially because sanctions are not exogenous. And I find that authors do very good work in solving this issue. And as just resumed, like they find that sanctions do inflate food prices and they deteriorate food security, and they find significant and heterogeneous effects. So first, I'd like to specify some clarifying questions which would probably help the authors to improve the manuscript, like to give the reader a more clear explanation from the very beginning of the paper. Like it was not very clear the time span of the analysis. I guess it was between 1990 to 2021. It was a little short, actually. List the sender and target countries. That would be helpful. Just two tables in the appendixes. and mention the type of sanctions early in the analysis. Even if you say that you target economic sanctions can be very different. Maybe some examples could help, because there can be sanctions against governments or sanctions against individual organizations, firms, persons, and how do you treat them? Do you consider them equal? Do you consider only some of them? How do you treat overlapping sanctions, like sanctions imposed on Russia in 2014 and then sanctions imposed on Russia in 2022 and so on by the same country? Does that add up, or just the effect remains unchanged? Some explanation of the data structure would also help. Like it wasn't very clear for me the exact structure of the data, which country pairs you included. Do you have in the analysis country pairs which are sanctioned or targeted by a sanction at least in 1 year? Do you have countries that are never targeted by a sanction, like to use to construct your control group? Does your data include lifted sanctions? And maybe some additional explanation on the entropy balancing, on how the exogenous control group is constructed would also be useful. If the control group is formed only by countries that were never sanctioned, or they include also sanctioned countries in years when they were never sanctioned, or in years when they was not sanctioned by a specific sender, and so on. Then I have 4 major comments. First, my first comment regards the way authors match country-specific dependent variables, which refers to the price of food products, well, the food price index in targeted country I at time t, and the explanatory variable sanctions, which is a dummy, I understand, which is bilateral, which is specific to the targeted country and the sender country in the same time t. Now, it seems to me that authors artificially inflate the data. If it's not the case, please clarify that. That would be really useful. And if that is the case, it would be good to know what effect it has on the results. Because in that case, the explained variable has much less variation than the explanatory variable. This could explain some of the results. And maybe as an alternative or robustness check, you could try a country-level analysis where you just aggregate the information on sanctions at targeted country level, like the number of sanctions or several variables measuring the type of sanctions issued on the targeted country. Then the second comment refers to the effect on food prices, which I found quite small, especially since all the evidence that is, all the discussion of the results in the paper brought in the introduction announces quite large potential impacts of sanctions on food prices and access to food in targeted countries. So actually the effect is around 1.4, 2.3% increase in food prices. Probably that comes from the fact that authors look at annual variations in food price indices. So probably food prices, they vary much more. There might be some way to explain high frequency data like monthly food CPI data provided by the FAOSTAT, or also price indices. If I correctly understood how FAO constructs that price indices, it includes adjustments in the product composition. So if some food products become very expensive, then consumers adjust to less expensive products, and that effect is not captured. So if that is the case, then to capture that effect, there will be some need to do so to explore this product dimension. And one way would be to look at prices at the product level. maybe on prices on the food imports, because within targeted countries, a large number rely heavily on food imports. Well, maybe that goes out of the scope of the analysis. Maybe it's just an extension, possible extension for the paper, just to think of it. Then my third comment refers to the interpretation of effect on food security. You explain in the introduction that the food prices are a strong element of food security, and it is so. So it refers, actually, reflects the access of the population to food products.
Sorry, Angela, I don't know if you're still going through your slides. We still see slide number 1.
Oh, really? Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you see the evolution?
Now we see slide 5. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really, I'm really sorry for that.
No problem.
Okay, so my first comment was on how to interpret the estimated impact on food security. So since you first look at the impact of sanctions on food prices, then on food security as measured by the undernourished population, at the same time, we know that food prices are an element of this food security. Is there a link between this? So how much of the effect on the of sanctions on food security comes from higher food prices? So that's probably the link that I would expect the most to work in this paper, like the most that kind of requires an answer. And then there are certainly other dimensions of food security, like the availability, the use, utilization, or stability. I don't mean that you need to explore all of them, just to mention them. And why do you focus on undernourished population? Maybe because of data availability. I tried to check a little bit on what exists also on other dimensions, and truly the share of undernourished population was the one that is the most well documented. But there might be interesting other dimensions of food security to mention or to consider in other analysis, like the serial import dependency ratio or the consumer expenditure on food products, which you mentioned in the introduction. And my final comment, it refers to the heterogeneous effect of sanctions. Well, the paper differentiates the effect of sanctions across their type, like trade sanctions, financial sanctions, travel sanctions. But there are some surprising results, or maybe unexplained, or maybe not. Well, you find differences, but for these 3 types of sanctions, but they're not very statistically significant. And somewhere you talk about you would have expected to have stronger impact from trade sanctions, not from trade, from financial sanctions, and you do not. And maybe you could comment on that. And similar, when you differentiate across standards, you find that sanctions on imposed by the United States are non-significant. So that was surprising for me. And they are strong, we find a strong effect of UN sanctions. And that was surprising as well, because I felt like thinking like UN sanctions would be like the least working ones. But maybe there is some heterogeneity in the data that is still unexplored, and you might work on that. I would expect, like in a globalized world, that the effect of sanctions would be amplified by the number of sender countries. And maybe that's what you capture through the stronger effect of UN sanctions, because there's like a number of countries are imposing sanctions on the targeted in this case. The fact that sanctions imposed by main economic partners of the targeted might hurt more. Well, the fact that you don't find significant effect for your sanctions, that would probably say no, it's not the case, but maybe you could just provide more discussion on that. And it would be really nice, but probably quite heavy, to explore the information on the stringency of the span of sanctions. And even if you include in your time span sanctions that are imposed and lifted, is there a differentiated effect on introducing sanctions and on lifting sanctions? Because there is less discussion on that, or maybe not at all in the literature. I really didn't find any. And I have just very few minor comments. Some of the control variables that you include in the estimations may be correlated. So you might want to check for multicollinearity. If that is the case, that may explain some surprising results, like countries with stronger trade openness face a high increase in food prices. And to support the method you employ, it would be nice to show in your estimation tables mirror estimations without balancing and with balancing. So you could see how the balancing affects the effect and the goodness of it. Okay. And just really minor comments on some statements in the manuscript, mainly in the introduction. It said that sanctions often target agriculture and food products, and I was very not convinced by this. It seems to me that that was the case in the 20th century and much less recently, because maybe, well, this is the knowledge I deduced from declarations that country targeting that sanctioning countries make, but maybe the reality is different. But if this is so, maybe the effect would even be larger if you looked only on sanctions that target agricultural and food products, because there I'd expect the effect to be much stronger. And just a final comment on the fact that you cite a lot of, in several occasions, the case of Russia and sanctions on Russia. Well, the case of Russia, well, the increase in food prices in Russia, whether it was after its occupation of Crimea in 2014 or after the war in Ukraine in 2022, it was not the result of sanctions on Russia. It was, in the first case in 2014, the result of Russia's own policy, which introduced an import embargo, which kind of banned over 50% of its food imports. So, yeah. So it would not be, well, it might generate some confusion when you talk about the case of Russia in this context. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm more specific with that by saying counter sanctions by Russia.
Yeah, I understand, but
they
still
impose the sanctions on themselves. So and ban.
Yeah, exactly. I understand, but exactly the fact that you stated several times in the introduction makes the reader think that this case is included in your data, but it is not in the analysis. Yep. Yeah. So I'll stop here and leave the floor for.
Thanks a lot, Angela. So 1 hour has passed since we started this webinar, and we are actually past the time that we needed to. So let me collect some further questions from the audience. There are already some questions and some comments in the Q&A, but maybe if someone would like to raise hand and unmute and speak and just ask the question yourself. So just raise your hand, we will allow you to unmute, and then you can also ask your question. Yeah, there is one. So Per Broderson, could you please unmute?
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you well. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I was listening to this presentation with some astonishment, and I've been posing already some questions as a kind of pre-warning what I wanted to discuss here in this regard. First of all, I wanted to know, maybe I should just tell you that I returned from Ukraine last week, and I was witnessing how bad things are going there for agriculture. And in the wake of Russia's war against Ukraine, how complicated it is for Ukrainian producers to export their goods, not only to the European Union, but also to the global South. My first question would be why you do not differentiate between sanctions and counter-sanctions. Why do you think that counter-sanctions, as an answer to sanctions, are necessary? You mentioned the example that Russia introduced so-called counter-sanctions, which is actually an embargo. And if you look at the trade policies of Russia since 2012, Russia has been embarking on the path of a kind of strategy replacing foreign technologies and deliveries by Russian ones. So I would challenge the idea that counter-sanctions are a natural way of countering sanctions as they have been imposed on Russia. Second is the EU sanctions against Russia, be they in the wake of the illegal annexation of Crimea since 2014 or the now ongoing sanctions against Russia, have never been including any kind of agricultural produce. Never, ever. It is possible that there are some side effects of the financial sanctions that might touch upon things like paying for some kind of agriculturally needed goods like fertilizers, but they do not hinder Russia to export its agricultural goods. This is something that needs to be taken into account, I think, very much if we talk about the development of food prices in Russia itself and also in the global south. The next question that I've been asking is why food security should be more endangered by so-called sanctions against Russia, which there are not, as I have to repeat here, than hindering Ukraine, who has been producing a lot of agricultural produce for the global south, exporting this produce to the global south at the moment. This is something that needs to be taken also into account. And last but not least, I do not see the clear linkage between upgoing food prices and imposing sanctions. I do not see the evidence. It looks logic, but I do not see the quite hard evidence. Maybe you can work out on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your questions and comments. So I will wait for other people to raise their hands. Otherwise, Kwaku has the questions here. He can read. I also have some comments and questions, and then maybe we go to the responses by Kwaku. So first,
can I take them now and then we come back to this? Otherwise, if you read a lot, my note is already so full.
I think it's better if you respond to everything,
all of them.
Yeah. So that we can finalize the meeting within 10 minutes. Yeah. So my point is, first, we don't see a stringency of sanctions as far as I see. I also saw another question in the Q&A. So I think the sanction variable that you use is a dummy variable, although some countries increase the stringency of sanctions against the target countries. So perhaps instead of a dummy variable, you could have a continuous or stock variable on the number of sanctions on each country. I had one paper that was on that, and it was published in, if I remember correctly, the World Trade Review. So maybe you could use a similar variable as the stringency. Then I'm not convinced about how you tackle the endogeneity bias, because what you have is just a composite measure of sanctioned countries, treated countries, and non-treated. You don't disentangle the causality here, and the causality goes from the target countries. It enforces a policy that endangers the sender country in any way. I'm not talking about military confrontation like what Russia initiated. It can be anything. So I don't see if you have tackled causality there, because what you could observe could be the results of bad policies of the target country rather than the effect of sanctions. Then I don't know. So going back also to the comment by Per just now. So I don't understand why normal sanctions should affect the prices of food more than other goods in the economy. Because as far as I understood, you adjusted prices by the CPI, and CPI already includes changes in prices of food products and agricultural products. I don't understand why there should be. So as long as you do not provide a mechanism or the conceptual framework on the mechanism through which food products are more affected than other sectors in the economy, it's not going to be convincing. So the comment that I have is on the case of Iran. So the Iranian food and agricultural products in the past 2 years has substantially increased by more than 100%. And the reason for that is not sanctions. The reason for that is not the sanctions that paralyze the whole economy. The reason for that is a substantial devaluation of Iranian rial against US dollar and a bad policy of the government 2 years ago to remove the preferential exchange rate. And the reason that food products are mostly affected by that was because there was a preferential rate that was supplied mainly on the imports of food products. So when a country is heavily dependent on the imports of food and agricultural products from abroad, that could be the devaluation case rather than the effects directly affecting the food products. So I think this should be conceptualized so that we could link the effect of sanctions on food products. Then I don't see any other raised hands, so I hope you managed to read through the questions and comments, and now you have some minutes to respond if you did.
Okay, for me to address, I think let me just focus on the Q&A before I come to Angela. Angela's comments, I think this is a great asset. You've really read the paper, and I thank you very much. These are very good comments, and I agree with a lot of the things you say here. Okay, let me start with the gentleman who just came from Ukraine. Yeah, he said that why am I not focusing on counter sanctions? I'm only focusing on sanctions and not the counter sanctions. You know, like if you look at Russia is a very, very different case. And even in this data set, I didn't even focus on Russia. I focus on mostly developing countries. You see, when US imposes sanctions on, let's say Malawi, and Malawi imposes a counter sanctions on US, it doesn't have any effect. So here, the focus of my paper or our paper is to look at countries that are very developed, US, UK, Canada, imposing sanctions on developing countries. These are countries that are mostly food insecure, have issues with food insecurity. So I'm not looking at counter sanctions mostly from countries like Russia. Maybe that may have an effect, but in this sample, Russia is not, I didn't even include Russia because of some of these counter sanctions. So I mostly focus on very developing countries. Yeah, so that is a comment a response to your comment.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you mentioned that example even on your slides. So
I mentioned that as a motivation, but I'm not saying that I mentioned that as a motivation for the paper. But in my paper, I did not focus on counter sanctions. Yeah, and I took Russia out because I have Russia that imposing sanctions, and also I have Russia both as a sender and then as a target, and I wanted to avoid that situation. So mostly in this analysis, Russia was not included. So I have not focused on counter sanctions. And the reason I'm explaining, I'm giving is mostly because counter sanctions by other countries, if you're not Russia or China, it doesn't bite. It doesn't have any effect. So it's only maybe Russia and that can say that I'm also imposing counter sanctions on you. But other countries, which are very developing countries, it's just a mere rhetoric. It means nothing. And then there was also a question on, you don't see a clear indication of how sanctions is linked to food prices. It's not clearly linked with food prices are not clearly linked to sanctions or to food security. This is the issue that, okay, maybe with sanctions, food may not be directly included in maybe or maybe let's say ban of export or what to that particular country. But you see, when I ban you from, let's say, doing international financial transfer, indirectly, I'm also curtailing you from buying anything you want to buy. So if I impose financial sanctions on you, it's going to have ramifications for you, your ability to even buy food as well. And I did a paper in 2019 where I looked at the effect of sanctions on international trade. You know, if you look at the Geneva Convention, it clearly stipulates that during periods of conflict, there should be free passage for essential products like food and medicine. But when you look at the effect of sanctions on those products, you see that there's an adverse effect of sanctions on those products. Though clearly nobody is imposing sanctions on pharmaceutical products. But when you look at what is the effect of sanctions, you see that there is a negative effect of sanctions on import of those products as well. So it's sometimes they're not directly involved, but indirectly they can be affected. So that's also the explanation for that. Yeah. And then you talk about there was a comment on the stringency of sanctions. And I think that is coming from, stringency of sanctions and looking at the incidence and then the severity of sanctions. That is a bit doable, but I see it as a major challenge. Because, you know, we doing this like a kind of an annual data. We don't have a situation whereby we want our data to be annual. So we have like one data for one observation for 1 year, and then it corresponds with maybe our food security indicators. So it becomes a bit challenging if I'm looking at, okay, what's the number of sanctions imposed on you within a particular year? So that is like the severity of the sanctions. I see that as a bit, but it's something we could try. But I don't know whether it's doable, because I have that challenge, because the data is dyadic. They look at the sender and then they look at the target, and you want to be able to match this with another annual data. So it becomes a bit very challenging, but it's something I think we can try to think and see whether is something we could do. And I think that's also related to a comment from Angela. Angela also made a comment very similar, that because of the dyadic nature, we have inflated the observations. And I think, yes, that is to a large extent very true, because we look at, okay, the same food price for country I, but we are looking at, this is repeated because we are looking at, if the sender is different, we repeat that. So it repeats the number of observations, so which is very true. But another way we could also do that, we could also look at, okay, sanctions in general, whether were you sanctioned by any of these countries without focusing on the specific. So that could also be done. We could do that. And I think we also played with that a bit, but maybe I've not added that to our results. But it's something I think we have considered, and we've also done that. Yeah. So that could be done. And then there is also the comments on the entropy balancing, not solving the endogeneity. I think I agree with that, because if you want to solve the endogeneity, we all know that you have to use the IV. That meets all the selection, that meets the exclusion restrictions and all of that. But this is something very difficult for me. I've been working on sanctions for almost 10 years now. My first paper on sanctions was in 2016. And I've also read a lot of papers, and it's very difficult. I don't see anybody using any IV to solve it. People just try to do some kind of a difference in indifference randomization.
So that's the problem of literature, in my opinion. Because if we want to provide data on sanctions, and if we want to work on sanctions, we should also have the cause for that sanctions, which is the policy of the target country. Yeah. So if we manage to compile such a database, that would be very good for the whole literature.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Yeah. So, and then on the mechanism, you know, this paper has been on the hold because we are still stuck on the mechanism. We want to really, I think that this paper will never be complete without us adding a mechanism to it. We want to look at the trade, agricultural productivity, even food aid. Those are the mechanisms we want to try to see. By what means is sanction going to affect agriculture food prices? Is it because of maybe there's a reduction in agricultural production, or is it because there's a reduction in trade or import of food, or is it because there's a reduction in food aid? So these are things we really want to do. We are also working on it. Yeah, so I agree with a lot of those points that you made. Yeah, so now I would come to Angela. Angela, thank you very much. These comments are very detailed, and I also agree with you that my presentation and then the paper are very different. I know we've done a lot of changes, and because of that, so that's why the presentations have been different from the paper I sent to you. So with the mechanism, I've also talked about that. We want to look at trade, agricultural productivity, food aid, and even foreign aid. For the time period is 2001 to 2021. And then the targeted countries are, I think, over 100. So in the previous, we have about 99. So I think that's something we could hear. And then you also made mention of us mentioning the types of sanctions early in the paper. So I think that's something that is we can just do quickly. And then yes, and then there was also a question whether the control group, the control group does countries that have never been under sanctions. So our control group will consist of countries that have never been under sanctions, as well as those that have been under sanctions before, but the sanctions have been lifted. So if I take, let's say, Afghanistan, maybe between a certain period, maybe 5 years, they were under US sanctions, but maybe the sanctions was lifted. So that will also be added as part of our control as well. So we may have the targeted country, but when the sanctions is lifted, that also counts as part of our control. So I think that's also a response to that comment. I've talked about the inflated number of observations, the dyadic nature of the data set. We could do the country levels, the country's level analysis as well, which I think is something we could also do. Then there was also the comment of the effect on food prices being very small. And I think that was also, we were also worried about that. But we think the issue could be because of the normalization that we did. Because if you look at the graph that I showed you of the food price index, you can see that it's just between 0.1 and 1.1. So if you see 0.014, it still looks very significant. And then one thing that we also have to understand is that these sanctioned countries are developing countries that spend a substantial amount of their income on food. So even a marginal increase in the price of food would, if you spend about 80% of your income on food, if there is even a 1% increase in price of food, I think that still has a lot of implication for you. It's still going to shift a lot of people under maybe the poverty line. So I think that is, but I think the main reason could be because of our normalization, because of how we deflated it with the consumer price index. Yeah. And then there was also the comment on looking at the other dimensions of food security. I think that's also a very fair point. But the only concern is that if you look at the FAO data on the different dimensions of food security, there's a lot of missing observation. If you look at all the different indicators, if you look at the dimensions and the different indicators, there's a lot of, I've tried that before. I did a paper on the dimensions, but there was a lot of missing observation. So that is a little bit of a challenge. FAO had that data and then they just pulled the data off their website. And now I have the data, but I don't have the salt because FAO has pulled that data off. So there's a lot of issues with looking at the different dimensions. And then also there was this question about our point that financial sanctions will have a more pronounced effect than trade sanctions. You see, I've explained this before, that when there is financial sanctions, even if it's not trade, it has an implication for trade. So if I ban you from doing international transfers, automatically it means that you cannot even buy from me, because how are you going to pay for the product I'm selling to you? So when there is financial sanctions, the expectation is that that effect should be more pronounced even than trade sanctions, because it's going to have the effect is going to be both on trade and then in terms of maybe remittances. So I think that's the explanation for that. And then the introduction, and you also talk about the introduction and lifting of sanctions. I think we have that because we look at every year the duration of sanctions. So if you have been under sanctions for, let's say, 5 years, and then it's lifted, that is like, it becomes 0. So we move from 0 to 1, 0. So when you are under sanctions, it becomes 1. When it's been lifted, it becomes 0. So you can move in and out into the sample depending on whether sanctions was imposed on you another time. So that is about that. And then there was also the issue about multicollinearity, I think, which is also a very fair point. I could look into that. I could also do maybe a kind of a correlation matrix between my covariates to see whether, but I don't think that is, because right now multicollinearity is not really a problem. If it's a problem, you see that Stata automatically drops those that are, especially those that are maybe perfectly correlated. But if not, maybe there might be issue for maybe significance, and then you have high R square, and then some of the variables are, most of your covariates are not significant. That's one indicator of multicollinearity, but I don't think that I've seen that in our results. Yeah. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the comments that you've given, and I think it's going to improve our paper significantly. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Kwaku, for the excellent presentation and discussion afterwards. So to conclude this session, we understand that sanctions have very negative effects or negative humanitarian effects on the target countries, but we don't know who to blame. Is it the target governments who are imposing and implementing, enforcing bad policies that lead to sanctions? Or is it the sending countries that should be blamed for the sanctions that they are doing? So thanks a lot, everyone. And we will have another sanction webinar next month again, and it will be presented by Julian Hinz. So we hope that you will be also there, or other people who joined as attendees will be also there. It's an important hot topic nowadays, as the new global order is shaping or reshaping itself. So we hope that we could provide more information and knowledge and evidence on the effects of sanctions to the public. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kwaku, for your presentation. Thanks, Angela, for the great discussion. Have a great day after this. See you in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.